On the night of April 14th, 1912, the transatlantic liner Titanic struck an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Within just 2.5 hours, the unsinkable giant vanished beneath the waves, taking with it the lives of nearly 1,500 people. For the few who survived, all that remained was hope, a hope that seemed impossible. And yet, a miracle found them. In this episode, we tell the story of Carpathia, the ship that rescued all 705 survivors of the Titanic. You'll discover how Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia single-handedly organized one of the greatest rescue operations in maritime history. How his ship exceeded its own maximum speed to reach the disaster site faster, and why, despite several other vessels being nearby that night, only Carpathia answered the call for help. But first, support us with a like and a subscription.
Carpathia was a modest passenger liner built for comfort, not luxury. In fact, when she first entered service, it didn't even have a first-class section. Launched in 1903, the ship belonged to the British company Cunard Line, which still operates to this day. Just a few years after Carpathia's debut, Cunard introduced two new giants, the legendary Lusitania and Maritime. These ships were among the fastest liners of their time and would later play pivotal roles during the First World War. The sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat, a tragedy nearly as devastating as the Titanic disaster, turned American public opinion sharply against Germany, pushing the United States closer to war. Meanwhile, Mauretania served as a dependable troop ship and later as a hospital vessel. Her incredible speed and the skill of her crew keeping her safe from enemy submarines. She even set a transatlantic speed record that stood unbroken for 20 years, earning the coveted Blue Ribbon, the prize awarded to the fastest ship to cross the Atlantic. But what about Carpathia? She never claimed the Blue Ribbon. She wasn't built to break records, only to carry people safely across the sea.
Carpathia was built for one simple purpose: to carry passengers between Europe and America and back again. There was nothing extraordinary about her. Dozens of ships did the same job, and Carpathia blended in among them. Humble, dependable, unremarkable. On the night of April 14th, Carpathia was on one of her routine voyages, sailing from New York toward the ports of the Mediterranean. Aboard the liner were 740 passengers, most of whom were already asleep. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. Just 40 minutes later, at 21 minutes past midnight, Carpathia's wireless operator tried to contact the great liner to send routine private messages. But the reply he received stopped him cold. "Come quickly. We have struck an iceberg. This is a distress signal, old man. Our position, 41.46 north, 50.14 west." The Carpathia's operator ran straight to the captain's cabin. In command that night was 42-year-old Captain Arthur Henry Rostron. The moment he heard what had happened to the Titanic, Rostron didn't hesitate. He ordered the ship to change course and head full speed toward the disaster. A message was sent back to the Titanic. Carpathia is 53 miles away, 93 kilometers, and coming as fast as possible. And it wasn't an exaggeration. That night, Carpathia pushed herself beyond her limits. To squeeze out every ounce of speed, Captain Rostron summoned all 3 shifts of firemen to the boilers and shut off heating and hot water throughout the ship. The engines roared to their limit, and Carpathia achieved her highest speed ever, 17.5 knots, roughly 32 kilometers per hour.
Her top speed was believed to be just 14 knots, about 26 kilometers per hour. But that night, Carpathia was flying through the darkness at a speed no one thought possible. As the ship raced toward the site of the disaster, Captain Rostron was preparing for the unthinkable, to receive 2,000 survivors. He mobilized everyone on board, the entire crew, and even some passengers, including several doctors who volunteered to help. There was no time to lose. Lifeboats had to be readied, gangways and cargo nets prepared to hoist children from the sea. Dining rooms were transformed into makeshift hospitals. Stewards were ordered to free up every available bed for the injured and the freezing. By the time Carpathia reached the area, Captain Arthur Henry Rostron had issued more than 20 separate orders, every one of them aimed at saving lives. While his crew carried them out, the captain would occasionally close his eyes and pray. That night, Rostron faced unimaginable pressure. On one hand, he couldn't abandon the thousands of souls from the Titanic stranded in the icy Atlantic. On the other, he knew he was risking the lives of everyone aboard his own ship. Pushing Carpathia beyond her limits through an ocean littered with icebergs, they could collide with one at any moment. It was a race against time and against fate itself. Later, Captain Rostron would admit that Carpathia's safety that night depended on split-second turns of the wheel. Fortunately, his skill and the steady hands of his crew were enough to guide the ship through the maze of ice. They maneuvered flawlessly between towering floes and reached the Titanic's last reported position in just 3.5 hours. Ironically, Carpathia hadn't even been the closest ship to the disaster. That night, another steamer, the Californian, was much nearer to the Titanic. Had she responded in time, almost everyone on the Titanic might have been saved. But the Californian never answered the distress calls. Just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg, the Californian's radio operator had switched off his equipment and gone to bed after a 15-hour shift. There was no one to replace him. When radio contact failed, the Titanic's crew began firing white distress rockets into the freezing sky. The Californian's watch officers saw them, but didn't understand their meaning. They reported the lights to their captain, yet he chose to ignore them. The Titanic even tried to communicate using a Morse signal lamp, flashing desperate messages across the dark ocean. But on the Californian, no one could make sense of the flickering code. By the time the Californian's radio operator woke up the next morning, the Titanic was already gone, and the sea was scattered with lifeboats and silence. As Carpathia approached the disaster site, her crew began firing white signal flares into the night, calling out to the darkness, searching for survivors. But there was no answer, no sound. No movement, only silence. For a moment, Captain Rostron feared they had come too late. Then, suddenly, a faint green light flickered in the distance. Moments later, from every direction, small lifeboats began to emerge from the dark,
one after another, rowing weakly toward the rescuing ship. When dawn broke, the full horror of the scene was revealed. The ocean was littered with ice, vast glittering fields of it, and among the floating debris of the Titanic were the lifeless bodies of passengers still wearing their life jackets. The area would later be called the floating graveyard. Even months after the sinking, bodies were still found drifting along that same route. The Carpathia's crew worked with speed and precision. They pulled the survivors from the lifeboats with incredible coordination. Those still strong enough climbed aboard using rope ladders. The weak were hoisted up in canvas slings, and the children gently lifted in mail bags. Once on deck, each survivor was wrapped in blankets, given dry clothes, and taken to the dining rooms, now turned into shelters, where they were offered hot drinks and broth before being led to warm beds to rest. Even Carpathia's passengers joined in, offering their own clothes and giving up their cabins to the rescued. Captain Rostron remained on deck until the very last survivor was safely aboard. But when the final lifeboat was emptied, he froze in disbelief. So few. He waited a little longer, hoping for more boats to appear, but none came. The sea was empty once again. Then Captain Rostron gave a final order. His radio operator was to send out a message to all ships. Carpathia had rescued the survivors of the Titanic and was now heading for New York. It was also from the deck of the Carpathia that the first news of the Titanic sinking reached the world.
The same ship, the Californian, that had ignored the Titanic's distress signals, did eventually turn back, attempting to reach the site of the disaster. But by then, it was far too late. Before Carpathia departed, a memorial service was held in her main saloon. Passengers from both ships gathered together in prayer, honoring the memory of those lost on the Titanic and giving thanks for those who had been saved. The journey back was long and grueling. Carpathia had to navigate through endless fields of icebergs in terrible weather, thick fog, cold rain, and towering waves. The mood on board was heavy. Once the initial shock had passed, anger and grief began to rise. Rumors spread among the survivors that the Titanic's radio operator had received iceberg warnings earlier that night, but they had been ignored. What had seemed like a tragic accident now felt like a preventable catastrophe. For 4 days, sorrow and outrage filled the ship, until at last Carpathia arrived in New York, where nearly 40,000 people waited at the pier. Only after every survivor was safely ashore did Carpathia continue her original voyage. She had not only saved 705 lives, but also carried with her the testimonies that would change maritime history forever. It was because of these eyewitness accounts that in 1914, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was established, along with the International Ice Patrol, charged with monitoring ice conditions in the North Atlantic. Captain Arthur Rostron and his crew were honored with numerous awards. Among them, Rostron received the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal, a rare recognition of true heroism at sea. Sadly, Carpathia herself would not survive much longer than the Titanic. Just 6 years later, during the First World War, she was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank beneath the waves. But even in her final moments, her crew upheld the same calm professionalism that had defined her greatest night. Not a single passenger was lost. All were safely evacuated into lifeboats. Want more untold stories like this one? Subscribe and share with friends who love history's hidden corners. Because this story, too, is about ships, tragedy, and the desperate fight for life.
much like Dan Simmons' novel The Terror, inspired by the real-life disappearance of Sir John Franklin's Arctic expedition in the 1840s. Though Simmons based his novel on meticulous research, the fate of Franklin's men remains a mystery. So the author turned to imagination and infused his tale with haunting elements of myth and horror.
And now, tell us, what are your favorite books or films about maritime disasters?